15. That's how old the King of England was when surgeons cracked open his chest and found 2 masses of rotting flesh where his lungs should have been. His hair was gone, his nails had fallen out, his skin had turned a bruised violet, and the flesh at the tips of his fingers and toes was being consumed by gangrene while he was still alive. But here's what makes this story impossible to forget. The boy on that table had already sent people to burn at the stake. He had rewritten the law of succession with his own hand. He had tried to erase his own sisters from history, and he did all of it before his 15th birthday. This is what actually happened to Edward VI, and why everything you think you know about him is wrong. October 12th, 1537, Hampton Court Palace, 2 in the morning. After a labour lasting 2 days and 3 nights, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, delivers a boy. England erupts. Te Deums ring from every church in the kingdom. Cannons fire from the Tower of London. Charles Wriothesley, in his chronicle, recorded the volley as a citywide barrage that shook the night. Bonfires blaze through every parish. The realm, as one courtier wrote, had received the heir whom we hungered for so long. This is a channel that finds the moments history tried to bury, the details so specific, so uncomfortable, that textbooks skip them entirely, and Edward's story is one of the most skipped of all. By the end of this, you'll understand how a 15-year-old boy dismantled a country, and how the country dismantled everything he built. If that sounds like a story worth hearing, stay. Because what happened next wasn't just a tragedy. It was an irony so precise, it almost looks designed. Henry VIII had spent 24 years and 6 marriages trying to produce a male heir. He annulled his first marriage. He broke England away from the Roman Catholic Church, an institution that had governed European spiritual life for over 1,000 years because the Pope refused to grant him a divorce. He executed his second wife. He watched his third wife die 12 days after giving birth to the son he had demanded from God and from history. 24 years, 6 wives, 1 surviving son. That son lasted 15. And the version of Edward that most people know, if they know him at all, is almost entirely fictional. Mark Twain turned him into a gentle child in The Prince and the Pauper. Textbooks reduce him to a footnote, a sickly boy wedged between 2 famous parents and a famous sister, a passive figure, a victim of circumstances. The real Edward was none of those things. To understand what Edward became, you have to understand what he was built to be. Henry didn't just want an heir, he wanted a weapon. The boy's education was designed from birth to produce the most formidable Protestant monarch in European history. His tutors were handpicked by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the same man who had engineered the break with Rome. Sir John Check, Sir Anthony Cook, Roger Ascham. These weren't ordinary teachers, they were ideological architects. By the age of 13, as the Encyclopaedia Britannica notes, drawing on the records of his tutors, Edward was reading Aristotle's Ethics in the original Greek. He was translating Cicero's De Philosophia into Greek, not from a translation, but from the Latin. He was writing theological treatises, and he was keeping a journal, a detailed, methodical chronicle of his reign that historians now consider the first true English diary. 68 pages in his own hand. Christopher Morris, in the Tudors, called him potentially the ablest of all the Tudors, then added a line that deserves to sit with you. It is also possible that, had he lived, he would have been the least attractive. And here's what most people never hear about. Edward wasn't raised like a prince. He was raised like an experiment. Henry VIII was so terrified of losing his only male heir that he ordered the boy's household scrubbed twice daily. Every dish was inspected. Every person who came near the child was screened for illness. Detailed written instructions governed everything. What he ate, who touched him, how the floors were cleaned. The Hectoan International Journal, drawing on medical histories of the period, describes the precautions as unprecedented. The future King of England grew up in something closer to a sterile containment facility than a nursery. He was isolated, monitored, and shaped from his first breath. The isolation did something to him. When the Italian physician and astrologer Girolamo Cardano visited the English court in 1552 and met the 14-year-old king, he was struck by the boy's brilliance. They conversed in highly technical Latin. Edward nearly exposed Cardano's fraudulent claims about the causation of comets. But Cardano also saw something else, something he dared not say aloud, because predicting the death of a king was treason. The boy had all the symptoms of consumption. He was already dying. Cardano left England and kept his diagnosis secret until he was safely back in Italy. That journal Edward kept is revealing not for what it contains, but for what it doesn't. There is almost no emotion in it, no warmth, no doubt. When his uncle, the Duke of Somerset, the man who had governed England on his behalf for 2 years, was executed on Tower Hill, Edward recorded the event in a single sentence. The Duke of Somerset had his head cut off upon Tower Hill between 8 and 9 in the morning. No reflection, no grief, just the time. This was the mind that would reshape England. Edward became king on January 28th, 1547, at the age of 9. He was crowned at Westminster Abbey 3 weeks later. The ceremonies shortened, officially because of the tedious length that might be hurtsome to a child, but also because the Reformation had already made parts of the traditional coronation theologically unacceptable to the reformers now running the country. His uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, became Lord Protector, regent in all but name. And within months, the transformation of England's religious identity accelerated beyond anything Henry VIII would have recognised or tolerated. The heresy laws were repealed. Protestant theologians from the continent, Martin Butzer from Strasbourg, Pietro Martire Vermigli from Italy, Jan Waski from Poland, were invited to England to reshape the church. Stained glass windows were smashed. Religious paintings were whitewashed. Shrines were dismantled. The wealth of parish churches was systematically stripped. In 1549, Cranmer produced the first Book of Common Prayer, a single English-language liturgy to replace the Latin Mass in every church in the kingdom. The Act of Uniformity made its use mandatory for millions of English men and women who had worshipped in Latin their entire lives. This was not reform, it was erasure. But the prayer book was only part of it. Edward's government dissolved the chantries, religious institutions that, as historian Christopher Hay documented in English Reformations, served as schools and centres of education in poor rural areas across England. The official justification was theological. Chantries promoted the Catholic belief in purgatory, which Protestantism rejected. The real motivation was the same one that had driven Henry VIII to dissolve the monasteries a decade earlier. Money. Chantry lands, goods and revenues flowed directly into the Crown's coffers. The poor communities that depended on them for basic education were simply abandoned. Religious reform and financial extraction moved in lockstep, wearing each other's clothes. And they resisted. In Devon and Cornwall, the reaction was violent. Villagers at Stamford Courtenay forced their priest to put his vestments back on and say the Latin Mass. The movement spread. Within weeks, over 6,000 armed rebels were marching east. They laid siege to Exeter. Their demands were explicit. Bring back the Latin Mass, bring back the old ceremonies, take away this book written in a language that was supposed to be theirs but felt like an invasion. The government's response was annihilation. Lord Russell was dispatched with a mercenary army that included Italian and German soldiers, foreign troops on English soil, killing English peasants over the language of prayer. The prayer book rebellion was crushed. According to historian Mark Stoyle, encircled with stone, Exeter's city walls, and corroborated by John Hooker's contemporary description of the city of Exeter, the dead numbered over 4,000, killed in battle or executed in the aftermath. Entire villages were emptied. Think about that number for a moment. 4,000 dead, and this was the Protestant side doing the killing. This was the government of a 9-year-old king enforcing a book written by his archbishop. Before Mary I ever lit a single fire at Smithfield, Edward's regime had already drenched the West Country in blood over a prayer book. Edward noted the rebellion in his journal. He did not linger on it. But here is where the story turns, where the boy king's fanaticism stopped being abstract policy and became something with a face and a name. Joan Bocher was an Anabaptist. She had spent years supporting the Protestant cause, distributing copies of William Tyndale's English New Testament at a time when owning one could get you killed. She had used her own money to feed and clothe prisoners of conscience. She had been an ally. Then her theology drifted. She began teaching that Christ had not taken flesh from the Virgin Mary, a position that both Catholics and the new Protestant establishment considered heresy. She was arrested, tried before Bishop Nicholas Ridley, and convicted. John Foxe, the same man who would later write the most famous account of Protestant martyrdom in English history, Acts and Monuments, was horrified. He went to John Rogers, the royal chaplain, and begged him to intervene. "Spare her life," he said. "Imprison her if you must, but don't burn her." Rogers refused. Burning, he said, was sufficiently mild for a crime as grave as heresy. Foxe took Rogers by the hand and said something that would become one of the most chilling prophecies in Tudor history. "Well, maybe the day will come when you yourself will have your hands full of the same gentle burning." 5 years later, under Mary I, John Rogers became the first Protestant burned at the stake during the Marian persecutions. Foxe had been right. But before that reckoning, there was the matter of the boy king's signature. Edward was 12 years old. The warrant for Joan Bocher's execution was placed before him. According to Foxe, he refused to sign. He wept. He told Cranmer, "What, my lord? Will you have me send her quick to the devil, in her error?" Cranmer insisted. The law of Moses demanded death for heresy. Edward, still crying, still a child, signed. But he said this, "Cranmer, I sign at your risk and responsibility before God's judgment throne." Joan Bocher was burned at Smithfield on May 2nd, 1550. She died still arguing with the men who lit the fire. Let that settle for a moment. A 12-year-old boy, weeping, signs a death warrant. The archbishop who made him do it told him it was God's will, and the woman who burned had once risked her own life to smuggle the very Bibles that the Protestant church was built on. The second burning came less than a year later, and this time there were no tears. George Van Paris was a Flemish surgeon. He had fled religious persecution in Flanders, the very thing England's Protestant establishment claimed to oppose, and settled in London. He became a naturalised English citizen. He joined the Dutch Reformed Church at Austin Friars. He lived, by all accounts, a quiet and prayerful life. His crime was theological. He believed that only God the Father was God, a position his accusers called Arianism. He was denounced by his own congregation, arrested, and brought before a tribunal that included Cranmer, Ridley, and Coverdale. The trial was conducted through an interpreter, because Van Paris spoke no English. He could not defend himself in the language of his judges. He was condemned on April 7th, 1551. He was burned alive at Smithfield on April 25th. Robert Wallace, in Anti-Trinitarian biography, recorded that he suffered with great constancy of mind and kissed the stake and faggots that were to burn him. Edward wrote about it in his journal. One sentence, flat, clinical. A certain Arian of the strangers, a Dutchman, being excommunicated by the congregation, was after long disputation condemned to the fire. No name, no reflection. A man who had crossed a continent seeking religious freedom was reduced to a certain Aryan in a boy's diary, and that is all that survives of George Van Paris. No letter, no statement, in his own words, no account written from his perspective. The only record of his existence is a one-line entry in the journal of the king who killed him. The system didn't just end his life, it erased his voice so thoroughly that 5 centuries later we cannot reconstruct a single sentence he spoke. That silence is itself a kind of evidence, proof that the machinery of orthodoxy didn't merely punish dissent, but made the dissenters disappear from history. This wasn't cruelty in the way we usually understand it. There was no sadism, no pleasure in suffering. It was something colder, conviction. Edward genuinely believed he was saving England's soul. The burnings were not punishments, they were purifications, and that's what makes them harder to process than anything his sister Mary would later do. Mary burned out of political desperation, trying to drag a country back to Rome. Edward burned out of certainty. He was 13 years old, and he was absolutely sure he was right. The irony, the one that would take 5 centuries to fully crystallise, is that the Protestant movement Edward championed was supposed to be the movement of individual conscience. The movement that said every person could read the Bible in their own language and find God without a priest as intermediary. And yet the moment that movement gained state power, it did exactly what Rome had done. It defined orthodoxy, it punished dissent, and it burned the people who disagreed. The mechanism was identical, only the doctrine had changed. So what happens when a boy raised on absolute certainty meets absolute power, and then loses the one thing he can't control? The system was deliberate. This wasn't a child being manipulated by adults. By the time Edward was 14, he was exerting real control. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, who had replaced Somerset as the dominant figure in the council, understood something that Somerset never had. Edward was not a puppet, he was a participant. Dudley took Edward seriously. He let the boy attend council meetings, he showed him state papers, he gave him the illusion of partnership. And Edward, brilliant and fervent, filled the space he was given. The Second Book of Common Prayer, issued in 1552, was more aggressively Protestant than the first. It denied transubstantiation outright. Altars were replaced with plain wooden tables. Priestly vestments gave way to simple surplices. The Act of Uniformity that enforced it carried real penalties for non-compliance. Historian G.R. Elton, in England under the Tudors, wrote that the 1552 prayer book marked the arrival of the English Church at Protestantism. It remains to this day the foundation of the Church of England's services, and Edward approved every word of it. He was not a figurehead. He was, at 15, a zealot with the machinery of the state at his disposal. His contemporaries called him the young Josiah, after the Old Testament king who purified Israel of false worship at the age of 8. The comparison was meant as a compliment. In hindsight, it reads like a warning. Then his body betrayed him. In January 1553, Edward developed a cough. It didn't stop. By February, when his half-sister Mary came to visit, he was bedridden. The imperial ambassador Jahan Shaif, whose dispatches to Emperor Charles V remain the most detailed medical record of Edward's decline, described what he saw over the following months with clinical precision. By April, Edward was spitting sputum that changed colour daily, greenish yellow, then black, then pink with blood. His doctors spoke of a tumour on the lungs. By May, Schleifer reported to the Emperor, "The King of England is wasting away daily, and there is no sign or likelihood of any improvement." His body began to swell, first his feet, then his legs, then his head. His hair fell out. Plasters were applied to his shaved scalp. On May 7th, a councillor named William Petre wrote a letter claiming Edward was improving. On the same day, the Duke of Northumberland told William Cecil that the doctors expected a full recovery. Both men were lying. The physicians had already given up. And then Northumberland did something that has haunted historians for 5 centuries. He dismissed the royal physicians and brought in an unidentified woman, a folk healer, a quack, who administered daily doses of a potion. We don't know exactly what was in it. We can't be fully certain of the ingredients or the intent, but Alison Weir, in The Children of Henry VIII, drawing on contemporary accounts, concluded that it almost certainly contained arsenic. The stated purpose was to prolong the king's life long enough for Northumberland to secure the succession. The potion did prolong Edward's life. It also destroyed what was left of his body. By July 2nd, according to Weir, Edward's skeletal frame had swollen grotesquely. His pulse was faint and erratic. His skin was discolouring. The flesh at his extremities was being eaten by gangrene. His nails had separated from his fingers. He could barely speak. Every breath was agony. His lungs, already consumed by infection, were now processing poison on top of disease. He was 15 years old. He had been king for 6 years, and the adults around him, the men who called themselves his protectors, his counsellors, his servants, were feeding him a potion to keep him alive long enough to sign one more document. This is the part of Edward's death that the textbooks leave out. Not the tuberculosis, everyone mentions that. Not even the political drama of the succession. What they leave out is the texture of the dying itself. The ambassador, Schaife, writing to Emperor Charles V, described a boy whose body had become unrecognisable, the swelling, the discoloration, a bruised violet tint spreading across the skin, the sputum that changed colour every day, cycling through yellow, green, black and pink, the hair falling out in clumps, the stench of the ulcers that the doctors could smell from outside the room. Historians still disagree about what exactly killed him. Jennifer Loach, in her biography Edward VI, argued it was a suppurating pulmonary infection, acute bilateral bronchopneumonia that created abscesses and slowly drowned him from within. Others, including the authors of a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, supported classical tuberculosis, pointing to the family history. His grandfather, Henry VII, and his half-brother, the Duke of Richmond, likely died of the same disease, and the arsenic theory has never been fully dismissed. The truth, as Shiva's dispatches suggest, may be that all 3 overlapped. Tuberculosis weakened him, pneumonia attacked the breach, and the quack's potion finished what the disease had started. We may never know for certain. What we know is the result. And through all of it, Edward was still conscious, still praying, still dictating. On July 1st, he made his final public appearance, dragged to a window at Greenwich Palace to show the crowd below that the king still lived. The people who saw him were horrified. Schaife recorded that he was so thin and wasted that all men said he was doomed. But even then, even as his body was consuming itself, Edward was still writing. The document is called the Devise for the Succession. Edward wrote it in his own hand. Its purpose was simple and enormous, to prevent his Catholic half-sister Mary from ever taking the throne. The original draft left the crown to the male heirs of Lady Frances Grey, his cousin. But there were no male heirs, and Edward was running out of time. So he made a single, decisive alteration, changing one phrase in the document to place the crown directly on Lady Jane Grey, Frances's 16-year-old daughter, who had conveniently married Northumberland's son just weeks earlier. When the judges of the King's Bench were shown the document and ordered to turn it into law, they refused. The Devise contradicted Henry VIII's will and the Third Act of Succession, both of which placed Mary next in line. Edward summoned them personally. He was 15, dying and furious. They capitulated. Think about what this means. A teenager, rotting from the inside, used the last weeks of his conscious life, not to make peace with his sisters, not to pray for his soul, but to rewrite the future of England in his own image. The fanaticism that had been planted in him by Cranmer and Check and Cook had grown so deep that it outlasted his body. His flesh was falling apart, and his will was still iron. And there's a detail in this that is easy to miss but impossible to forget once you see it. The alteration Edward made to the Devise, the one that changed everything, was tiny. He changed the phrase to the Lady Francese's heirs males to the Lady Francese's heirs males and her, adding 2 words and then modifying the sentence further to read to the Lady Jane and her heirs males. 2 words, the fate of England, the fate of Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, the entire arc of the English Reformation, turned on 2 words added by a dying boy's trembling hand. Chris Skidmore, in Edward VI, the lost King of England, argues that this was not Northumberland's manipulation. It was Edward's own conviction. The boy knew exactly what he was doing. He was bypassing the law, overriding his father's will, and gambling the Tudor dynasty on his personal theology. And he was doing it from a bed he could no longer leave, in a body that was already decomposing. Edward VI died at Greenwich Palace at 8 o'clock in the evening on July 6, 1553. Sir Henry Sidney, one of the gentlemen of his privy chamber, held the boy in his arms at the end. Edward's last recorded words, according to John Fox, "I am faint. Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." But just before that, as Chris Skidmore recounts in Edward VI, the lost King of England, drawing on Sir Henry Sidney's account, he had prayed at length, and the prayer tells you everything. He begged God to defend this realm from papistry. He asked for the preservation of thy true religion. Even in the act of dying, Edward's final thought was not of mercy, or of peace, or of the people he had burned. It was of doctrinal purity. The surgeons opened him afterward. 2 putrefied ulcers in the lungs, the body of a 15-year-old boy who had reigned for 6 years and 4 months, destroyed from within. The consequences arrived immediately and inverted everything Edward had built. Lady Jane Grey, his chosen heir, was proclaimed Queen on July 10th. She lasted 9 days. Mary Tudor, the Catholic sister Edward had spent his dying months trying to exclude, rode into London to overwhelming popular support. The country that Edward had tried to make irreversibly Protestant chose by acclamation to put a Catholic on the throne. Mary reversed every one of Edward's reforms. The Latin Mass returned. The Book of Common Prayer was abolished. The altars went back up. The vestments came back. And then the burnings began, on a scale Edward could never have imagined. In 45 months, Mary I burned 283 Protestants alive, 227 men and 56 women, according to John Fox's Acts and Monuments. That's more than twice the number burned in the previous 150 years combined. Tradesmen, married couples, at least one family burned together, parents and daughter side by side. Among the dead, Thomas Cranmer, the archbishop who had shaped Edward's faith, who had insisted Joan Bocher must die, who had told a weeping 12-year-old that God demanded it. Cranmer burned at the stake in Oxford on March 21st, 1556. Nicholas Ridley, who had sat as judge at the trials of both Joan Bocher and George Van Paris, burned alongside his colleague Hugh Latimer on October 16th, 1555. And John Rogers, the royal chaplain who had told Fox that burning was sufficiently mild for heresy, he was the very first Protestant to burn under Mary. February 4th, 1555. Smithfield, the same ground where Joan Bocher had died 5 years earlier. John Fox's prophecy, "The day will come when you yourself will have your hands full of the same gentle burning had landed with surgical precision, and the legal precedent that justified every one of those 283 executions, that heretics could be burned under the English crown, was the same precedent that Cranmer himself had invoked to burn Joan Boca and George Van Paris under Edward. The Protestants who prosecuted those two burnings gave the Catholics the tools to prosecute 300 more. Henry VIII broke a church to build an heir. The heir broke a country to build a faith. The faith broke everyone who built it. And somewhere in the archives of the British Library, there is a 68-page journal in a boy's handwriting, meticulous, cold, and utterly certain, that records the destruction of an entire world in the same tone you might use to note the weather. Edward VI was buried at Westminster Abbey, next to his grandfather Henry VII, beneath the altar of the Lady Chapel. No grand monument was erected. The imperial ambassadors noted that the body was carried to his grave with small ceremony. 24 years, 6 marriages, and 1 male heir, and in the end, even the funeral was quiet.